Welcome everybody to today's webinar. People are still joining the call, but I'd like to start. And if we could perhaps move to our first chart. And if we can move one more chart, please. We'd very much like to start today's webinar with a thought to the very sad circumstances in the UK, and I think internationally as well. Here we're all reflecting on the loss of the Queen and Her Majesty's contribution to public life, both in the UK and internationally. At Fidelio, for those who have visited our offices, we feel very close, particularly close to all that is happening now. We're a stone's throw away from Buckingham Palace. And earlier this summer, we felt at the heart of the celebrations for the Platinum Jubilee. One theme that came across very clearly was the royal family's commitment to sustainability and the environment. Now, in this period of mourning, we see the extraordinary preparations underway as the world pays respects to Her Majesty the Queen. We at Fidelio, and I'm sure I'll speak for all of you as well who are on the webinar today, are deeply saddened by the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. We share in the public grief and send our condolences to the royal family in their private sorrow. We would like to take this opportunity to express our appreciation for Her Majesty's service to the nation and to the Commonwealth. And we'd now like to move really very much on that theme of sustainability. To the next chart, please, Alex. We're going to talk today about the ESG Committee Chair, close to the heart of sustainability and the environment. It's a theme that's been very much on our radar screen, as I think many of you will know. And I'm joined by my colleagues to think this through from a number of different angles. I'll introduce each as we move through the webinar. But if we could move to the next chart. As Fidelio has been working with boards in a number of different contexts, we've seen this theme of the ESG Committee, the ESG Committee Chair, and ESG more broadly, very much in focus. On the search side, this includes both the competence, the skills within the context of the boardroom, as well as a strong interest in sort of benchmarking capability across boards and internationally. On the development side, we've seen a very clear focus on, for example, climate change competence, Section 172 reporting for UK boards, and also D&I and what needs to come to the board in terms of the people agenda. And again, on evaluation, every board evaluation has shareholder expectations and ESG interwoven. It's a key theme, and it's absolutely become embedded in the board evaluation, as well as the benchmarking as to what peers are doing and how they're approaching this complex subject. So from a number of different angles, we're very much seeing this theme of the ESG committee very much on the board agenda. And if we move to the next chart, we took up this theme in the context of a recently published report where we asked three very clear questions. If ESG is a board matter, is an ESG committee warranted? Secondly, does the board give equal weight to the E, the S, and the G? And thirdly, the skill sets that are required around the boardroom table so that the board can do justice to the ESG agenda. We drew upon a broad range of sources, including interviewing a number of FTSE ESG committee chairs. And some of the results will inform today's webinar, and the report is available for those who perhaps haven't had the opportunity to read it. And today's webinar, if we look at the agenda in the next chart, we're going to focus initially on the key drivers of ESG, what's behind this current focus. Secondly, we'll look at the board and the ESG committee and how the two work together. And thirdly, we're going to look specifically at the ESG committee chair, which is becoming a really important board role in its own right. And next chart, please. Before we move on to our speakers, I'd like to just use the opportunity to share your thoughts really on this subject. And our first question today is very simply a poll question. Does your board need an ESG committee? Yes or no? So if I could ask all participants to vote, that would be, we look forward to your results. I should add, I don't think the panelists can vote. And Amy, if you're able to share with us when you have the results. That's interesting. So 73% are of the opinion that, yes, the board does need an ESG committee, but still, and I think that probably reflects broadly, maybe the FTSE as well, there's a group that don't think an ESG committee is necessary. And this is a thought that we will explore throughout this webinar. Our next poll question, and this is rather cheeky of us, is a slightly more detailed one. What is, and I'm going to ask you to select one key priority experience that's required for the ESG committee chair role. A, environmental expertise. B, expertise in the S, the D, E, and I, and social engagement issues. C, government and regulatory experience. D, business transformation experience. E, strong influencing skills. Or F, prior ESG committee experience at board level. So only one choice, I'm afraid. And if we could open that up to the poll question. And again, Amy, if I could ask you to share the results as they come through. This takes a little bit of processing. It's a complex result. So interestingly, E, strong influencing skills, are singled out as the most important. I know we'll come back to this, and I think we probably endorse that finding that it's probably not the technical skills, but I think we're sort of very much pointing in the same direction as our audience today. So if we could move to the next chart, please. And now we'll start with the key drivers of ESG. We're not going to dwell on the regulatory framework, but it is worth just sort of putting into context that we are at a point where, you know, broad international agreement is beginning to be reached on key ESG issues, and probably principally the environment. This is beginning to be translated into meaningful national legislation, and it's also being translated into sector regulation. And this will be impacting all your boards, all your companies, often in a fragmented way, that the issues may overlap, they may not overlap. But there's a clear regulatory and legislative framework that's driving the ESG agenda. But also, there's a very clear financial agenda, which is really important. And I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Steve Cheetham, to take us through some of that, some of the implications of access to capital. Steve, if I could hand over to you, please.
Thank you, Gillian. Yeah, so we'll kick off today with a quote from Larry Fink, who has really been in the vanguard. That's quite a bad joke, actually, because Vanguard's one of his major competitors, but he's one of the boss of one of the biggest asset management companies globally. And what he's saying in this quote is that we've moved on from shareholder primacy, that stakeholders are really important, and the social context and the environmental context for business really matters. And he's linking that here to long-term value. So why do we think Larry Fink's so much in the front of the ESG investment agenda? Next slide, please. Well, the bottom line is that ESG investments are growing very, very strongly. If you believe Bloomberg's forecast, by 2025, ESG managed assets, so that's equities and bonds, will make up fully 1/3 of global investable assets. And that's about 50 trillion. So that's $50 trillion in ESG investments. So they're big, they're growing. Where's this coming from? Well, a big piece of it is not just the social context, because I think the world has moved on in terms of thinking about the social and environmental impact of investment, but it's also due to structural change in the investment market and in the pension market. And here I would highlight the fact that most defined contribution pension schemes actually give their savers a choice as to what they want to invest in. Back in the day when defined benefit schemes were managed by faceless committees, the business of sustainability and ESG factors came up less. Today, we have many investors, especially younger people, preferring to put their pension money in ESG or sustainable financial products. So that's a big trend, and although DC assets are still small relative to defined benefit schemes, they're getting bigger by the day. And the good news, by the way, for our children's futures is they do seem to be saving well. Certainly in the UK, the volumes of DC assets are growing strongly, and they like ESG sustainable products. Now, clearly, the fund management industry is never slow to spot a margin opportunity, particularly in the context of passive investment, which tends to negatively impact investment firms' margins. They see in sustainable ESG investment an opportunity. And I think it's fair to say that the industry is embracing this opportunity with both hands. However, ESG investors do have some major challenges, and the first of these is there isn't really a consistent definition of what ESG means in investment terms. And in particular, there's a big tendency, or a big temptation perhaps, for investment firms to rebrand their existing products as sustainable or ESG, and thereby expose themselves to charges of greenwashing. And indeed, we've already seen at least one instance where regulators have got involved in an investment company because it's been thought to be greenwashing, and this is DWS in Germany. So this is a major risk. Greenwashing is a major risk, not just for investors, but also for companies and boards. And just to make things even more complicated, given the state of US politics, we already have a situation where BlackRock and other investors are being pilloried for their focus on ESG, and certain US states are even considering passing laws forbidding pension funds to invest in sustainable development and not to invest in fossil fuels. So you can see that the arena is really quite complex and it's changing over time. Next slide. However, if I'm an ESG investor, what I want from companies is reasonably straightforward. And here we just highlight some of the things that you'd be looking for if you were an investor looking at a company's annual report or talking to its board and its CEO. You want a clear and credible path to net zero. You want a company that acknowledges climate change and that is taking concrete and sensible steps to mitigate its carbon footprint. You want evidence of a commitment to social goals, and these are both internal to the firm and external to society, the society in which the company finds itself. And this is all about diversity, equity, inclusion, community engagement, ethical supply chains, and so on. Third, you do want compliance with the highest standards of corporate governance. Now, corporate governance in most equity markets is laid down in codes. In the US, of course, there is no particular officially endorsed code, but there are various quite worthy documents produced by various bodies. As an investor, you want compliance with those sorts of codes, and you probably also want compliance with the UNPRI. You also want good reporting. Now, there's a lot of non-financial reporting in annual reports. This has been growing dramatically, I think, over the last 10 years or so. And as an investor, you want this to be clear, consistent, targets and metrics for achieving goals, not just environmental ones, but also social goals in terms of diversity, inclusion, and social impact. So I think the scorecard, if you like, for business is a relatively well-defined one in its outlines, at least. However, next slide, please. The ESG arena is changing all the time. And I think we can look at global politics and we can look at the Ukraine war to illustrate the fact that the global context has changed dramatically. And far from discrediting ESG and discrediting the idea of sustainable energy, for example, the changing global context does require investors and boards to be very light on their feet, to be fast to react, especially around renewable energy, but also around things like defense. If we go back 12 months and you talk to the boss of a German defense firm, he will have said to you, well, I'm not really all that interesting to an ESG investor. I'm basically uninvestable because I make weapons. And that changed overnight. In February of this year, that changed overnight. And the European defense industry suddenly became investable again. And there are obviously ESG investors out there who would still not want to get involved in weapons. Nonetheless, that example shows you how the definition of ESG changes over time. And finally, at Fidelio, we believe very strongly that the E and the S are linked. If you just focus on climate change, that's all very well, but you have to think about the social impact. And indeed, one of the reasons why we're worried about climate change is about the potential social impact. We've all seen what's happened in Pakistan. We've all seen the maps that indicate if we do have 4 or 5% warming, just how much of the globe is going to become uninhabitable. The social context of that is really important. So you can't have a greener economy and exclude the poorer people in our world. And I think that was probably it for my bit. I shall hand back to Gillian.
Thank you, Steve. And I think that's absolutely right. That transition to a greener economy, it cannot be at the expense of the poorest. It's really that interconnectivity between the E and the S. We are getting questions on the Q&A already, and I'm delighted to see that. So please, if you have questions, do share them with us, and we'll have time to address as many as possible during the webinar. I've also been prompted, asked one about the charts, and yes, the charts will be available after the webinar, but also to introduce my colleagues. So forgiveness, I'm sort of from my colleagues. Steve Cheetham, these are all colleagues within Fidelio. Steve was a former senior buy-side and sell-side analyst, and so brings a lot of experience of the markets and perspectives of how investors are thinking about ESG. And Alistair Stranack, who'll take the next part of the webinar, also a colleague from Fidelio, who's joined Fidelio with a very strong ESG and strategy background and really thinks through the sort of the implications of embedding ESG in the work of the board and in strategy. So Alistair, if I could hand over to you to look at the work of the board and the ESG committee.
Thank you, Gillian. Hopefully we can get our sound to work. We had a few problems when we were doing the rehearsal for this. The first thing I think to say, I'm now going to look at ESG from the corporate side. The first thing to say is that ESG is clearly a board matter, and I don't think there's a lot of argument about that. And as we see some of the implications of ESG, it becomes very clear that it must be an issue that is debated and discussed at the board table. The impact of ESG on many businesses, business model, the huge levels of investment that are required, the complexity of trading off once you start to think about multiple stakeholders. All of these things are clearly board matters, as well as several other things, the importance of ESG to attracting and retaining the best talent, and also just simply the risks associated with ESG and the consideration of those, and of course the opportunities. So there's nothing I'm going to say in the next section that says that ESG is anything other than a board matter. But what is happening is that boards have been going through the process of considering how ESG should be embedded into the work of the board. So if you could just put the next slide on, please, Alex. And there's typically there's a real sort of choice of two ways to do it, and boards are choosing both of these ways. So firstly, creating an ESG committee, much in the same that you create committees for audit or risk or remuneration, to support the work of the board and to conduct some of the heavy lifting involved in dealing with ESG issues. So that's one option. The other one actually is to say that the existing committee structure is sufficient, and that we should work through the existing committee structure in order to embed ESG into the work of the board. Now, our view at Fidelio is that both of these choices are valid, and we do see companies making either one of those choices. But the key thing is to ensure that ESG doesn't drop off the board agenda or slip between the cracks. So if we look at the option of no ESG committee before, obviously we're going to get back onto the value of the ESG committee. Could you put on the next slide, please? And let's look at some of the pros and cons of deciding to deal with ESG using the existing committee structure. And so firstly, the pros, many firms actually argue that keeping ESG at the board sends a strong signal that ESG is one of the most important things. It's clearly something that is dealt with by the board itself. ESG issues are scheduled on the board agenda and woven into the existing committee structure. This avoids the creation of additional committees. It can deal with a lot of the issues associated with ESG, but it's important to remember that whatever you do, the ESG and consideration of ESG is going to increase the workload of the committee structure. So it's not as if you have a choice of like, let's bring in a new committee or let's just sort of stick where we are. The existing committee structure has to handle a lot more if it's going to deal with all of the issues associated with ESG. So if we look on the downside of no ESG committee, I think the first thing is that from the perspective of investors and stakeholders, the signal being sent by not creating an ESG committee may well be the opposite to what's intended. So keeping it at the board may not be as strong a signal as a company wants to make that it's taking ESG seriously, whereas setting up an ESG committee is a very clear signal of the company's commitment. The board also may not have the time or the skill to provide the scrutiny of ESG, within the constraints of the board calendar without the use of an additional committee. And then you do get the problem that ESG may slip between the cracks of the various committees if there's no coordinating oversight that can be provided by a single committee that is looking at all of the issues across the ESG agenda. So let's just look at what's happening in practice, and this really supports the fact that ESG committees are becoming increasingly common. The vote that we did at the beginning, the poll, your responses to the poll were even stronger than this. But actually, this year, 2022, is the first year in which more than half the FTSE 100 boards have a dedicated ESG committee or equivalent. Now, the pattern is different across the world. Perhaps, it's not perhaps surprising that in the US, the proportion of companies that do choose to have an ESG committee is lower, but that in itself is increasing. And also the stats from Asia are much more difficult to get hold of, but it's certainly very clear that the use of a committee within Asian businesses is very much rarer. It's worth noting, if we just look at the next slide, it's worth noting that that ESG committees are not the same, are not all the same. There's a significant variation in the names of the committees that we can see here. These are all taken from FTSE 150 companies, and also the remit is often quite dependent on the nature of the business itself and the issues that are being that are important to that business. And so we see a range of different kind of committees, a range of different remits. And I think as well as reflecting differences in industries, in the industries and the challenges that the businesses face, this also is another reflection of the fact that ESG is an evolving area. So there is no clear single model that is going to work across all companies in the way that we see perhaps in something like audit. If you go on to the next slide, please, Alex. Gillian referred to a fairly significant piece of research that we've done over the last few months, which included interviews with ESG committee chairs. And out of that, we've got a number of themes as to why companies are choosing to go down, increasingly to go down the route of having an ESG committee rather than dealing with it through the existing committee structure. And there are three kind of main themes. The first one is to relieve the burden on a packed board agenda. and this is the issue that I touched on earlier, to say that, you know, within the normal agenda of a board, there just isn't time, and there sometimes isn't the skills to give ESG the prominence and the importance that it deserves, and a committee provides the opportunity to conduct that kind of heavy lifting. The second thing is around close collaboration. ESG spreads its tentacles across, pretty well all aspects of the company. And providing an ESG committee means that there's a very clear point of coordination, and that coordination extends across all of the committees as well as the ESG committee. And Gillian will touch on this a bit later on in the webinar. And then the final one that was very clear amongst the group of people that we interviewed, the group of chairs that we interviewed, was that it is a very strong signal to say that ESG is taken seriously by putting a committee in place and making it very clear that there is a group of people who are dealing in detail with the requirements of ESG. And I think the final point is that we're starting to see kind of external parties and important influences of investors moving towards the position that that an ESG committee is going to be positive for ESG performance. So Glass Lewis, in a recent report, came to the conclusion that there was evidence that companies with a standalone committee do display better ESG performance. And obviously, once the likes of Glass Lewis start to say that, that becomes fairly influential in terms of the way that companies are thinking. So there is an emerging correlation or emerging link there with material ESG performance with the use of an ESG committee. So that hopefully gives you an introduction to some of the ways that companies or boards are thinking about how they structure themselves to best embed ESG within their companies. And I'm now going to hand back to Gillian to talk a little bit more in detail about the remit of the ESG committee, and also particularly in consideration of the requirements for the ESG chair.
Thank you, Alistair. I'm delighted that we're also receiving a lot of questions, and we'll try to, some of which Alistair I think may have answered, and we'll try to answer during the course of the webinar as well as in the Q&A session. But now moving on to the ESG Committee Chair, I hope we've made clear we have no axe to grind one way or another. I think our focus is ESG needs to be handled carefully and embedded into the work of the board, and that there is a trend towards the use of the ESG committee. One thing that I think is very important is clarity. And we often see that, ESG committees perhaps start as a mixture of a board and executive committee. And but what we are seeing increasingly is this committee evolving into a board subcommittee, and there'll often be an executive ESG committee, a reporting line between the chair of that ESG committee, who may well be the CSO, reflecting the work of the board. And I know one of the questions was, is there a danger that the board, the ESG committee or the board can become too executive in ESG? And I think, we are seeing that companies and boards that are really making progress here are very clear about what the role is and at which level. So here in this chart, we're seeing that the board's responsible for approving ESG strategy and overseeing its implementation, encouraging levels of ambition, and also ensuring the oversight of risk and integrity of reporting. The executive develops and proposes the strategy, drives ESG and innovation, very importantly, and engages with the key stakeholders and implements the ESG strategy. So you can see that what you're seeing at other levels of the governance structure also applies with regard to ESG. And next chart, please. And really based on the research that we did, we also found that when companies and when boards adopt an ESG committee structure, they're becoming very clear about what they want that ESG committee to do. And here were some of the principal aspects of the remit of the ESG committee. First and foremost, reviewing ESG strategy and the KPIs, how it's measured, how it's overseen. A point, and I know we've had questions on this, overseeing the ESG risk register, absolutely. And you could debate whether there's yeah, whether this is standalone or not, but certainly the ESG committee should be contributing to and ensuring that ESG is properly embedded in the risk register, and perhaps other forms of thinking about risk and for example, scenario planning, which is so closely associated with TCFD. And also reputational risk is a major theme, and the risk of greenwashing that Steve mentioned earlier. Defining ambition, hugely important. You know, is there enough ambition? Is the company being realistic? Going back to that greenwashing point, you know, can you substantiate the ambition and the goals that you've set? The Section 172 reporting specifically for UK boards, tremendously important. And here the ESG committee has an important contribution to make. The next point, monitoring diversity and inclusion. Now, the people agenda may or may not sit, as with many other things, within the ESG committee, but clearly employees are a very important stakeholder. And this is an example of, you know, the ESG will often ensure that this coverage is being fulfilled perhaps by another committee. But this point did occur on many of the ESG committees that we looked at as sort of an accountability for employees as well as the community in terms of stakeholder accountability. And the communication around ESG issues, the last point, in particular, making sure that ESG comes to the board in an appropriate way. We often see that boards can struggle to get their arms around ESG because it's so amorphous. And the ESG committee can play a really important role in just helping to structure what comes to the board and where the board is taking the decisions it needs to take. And we can come back, if you wish, to how often ESG committees meet, etc. Next chart, please. And if we look here at the skills that are required. Now, this is obviously one of the poll questions. And again, I think we were pretty much in line with the findings from the poll. Our research tells us that it's seldom that a specialist, a pure specialist, is appointed to the ESG committee chair role solely on those specialist skills. Now, those technical skills may well sit within the ESG committee, but of much greater importance for the ESG committee chair is certainly an engagement with the ESG agenda. Increasingly also transformation skills and change advocacy skills. Really important, that those sort of ability to communicate, the ability to influence, often a strong external network, that there will be an expectation that the ESG committee chair will be bringing insights back into the boardroom discussion. And so this is not a role for somebody who is inward looking. It's very much an external sort of facing role. And a general observation that we've made in the work that we're doing, we do expect that the technical ESG expertise in the boardroom will increase over the next few years. This is partly, well, quite largely driven by climate change, but we do expect to see more board members with perhaps a science or engineering background in the UK than perhaps we've had previously. And next chart, please. One of the points I think that will have come across during this webinar is this is a very new committee. It's structured in different ways. And again, when boards and committees are getting this right, we see that real attention is being paid to how you actually construct the committee, how you build the committee. Clarity of remit, we've talked a little bit about that. Also committee membership. This can vary, it can be the entire board or it can be a subset of the board. The expertise is really important, and we expect the ESG committee to be advising, prompting, encouraging the board to ensure it has a pipeline of ESG expertise. Ensuring support from the CEO and CFO might sound like a sort of, an absolute given. But particularly on the finance piece, a lot of the research that we did indicated the importance of ensuring that the CFO and the finance team are also really working very closely with the ESG agenda. Otherwise, you'll hit brick walls. The board, the chair of the board, a pivotal role. In a few instances, the chair of the board will also chair the ESG committee. But in all instances, we found that the chair was either attending the ESG committee meetings or certainly either as a member or a guest, an observer, and certainly lending her or his weight to the work of the ESG committee. Equally, the linkage and connectivity between the committee chairs was built into the design of the committee, so that the ESG Committee Chair knows what the REMCO Chair is working on, and similarly with audit, for example. Access to independent expertise, as with other committees, this will become increasingly important, and particularly in that role of oversight, it is important that the committee does have that access when it needs it. And also thinking through how the committee engages with the executive. It shouldn't become executive, again, responding to the question, but it does need to have access to the executive, and that needs to be defined as with the work of other committees. Next chart, please. And my final chart here is simply setting that out in an organogram, essentially, how the work of the various committees fits together. And one thing I would observe is that this isn't set in stone. We are seeing the ESG committee evolve, and we are seeing leading players who've had an ESG committee for some time being prepared to develop and evolve the remit. And so, this is an area of fluidity, and I think that's actually quite important for the ESG committee chair. And we've set out here some of the key ESG tasks that each of those committees will be overseeing and supporting the board with that work. Now, one of the questions that we had ahead of the webinar was the appointment process for the ESG committee chair. And so I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Mark Cumberledge, to just share a couple of insights on what we're seeing in terms of appointments. So if I could hand over to Mark, please.
Yes, thank you, Gillian. We are indeed often asked, what should the remuneration be for an ESG committee chair? And the simple answer is that there is no standardized approach to how the ESG committee chair should be remunerated. And this is also true for the committee members. And the reasons for this is the relatively recent origins of this committee and the differing range in remit between companies. However, we are finding that the ESG committee chair is increasingly being paid in line with other board committee chairs, with the typical exception of the audit committee chair, who frequently commands a higher fee. Our expectation is that there will be an upward revision of the fees for the ESG committee chair as the focus and scrutiny around the ESG agenda increases. Next slide. It is also recognised that the ESG skill sets within the boardroom are developing and improving, yet understandably, there is still a skills gap between where they are and where they need to be. And in a recent study undertaken by PwC, they found that 47% of executives believe their board lack expertise across the ESG agenda. So Fidelio is aware it is essential that the board members need to be ESG competent, and that's all board members. And as such, we screen for ESG in every NED search process, and not only for those who will be on the ESG committee. So each interview we conduct explore the candidates' firstly, understanding of ESG, how this relates to the company and the sector in terms of both the risks and the opportunities. And secondly, we explore for aptitude and openness to ongoing learning and keeping abreast of ESG issues. And in addition, we here at Fidelio assist boards to increase their ESG effectiveness through board development, aiming to upskill existing NEDs on issues such as ESG governance and climate change competence. And also through board evaluation, including an assessment of the board's ESG capabilities and their structures. Back to Gillian.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to now move to the Q&A session. I'm aware that that was quite a long presentation. I think perhaps we can drop the charts just for the time being, Alex. What I'd like to do is group the questions because they are coming in categories. And one of the sort of groups of clusters of questions that we've received, particularly from financial services, is risk and ESG, the risk committee and the ESG committee, and how that's structured. And maybe if I could just chip in, and then I'm going to turn to Steve and to Alistair. I mean, what we're seeing on the whole, risk sits with the risk committee. I have seen some instances of the ESG committee overseeing risk altogether. But on the whole, risk sits with the risk committee, with ESG advising very strongly. And what you absolutely don't want is sort of two risk registers. I think what we've seen is that ESG is definitely, understanding ESG risk is really important, and helping the risk committee to think through those risks is a real contribution. And I mentioned before the reputational risk. I mean, I think companies have become acutely aware, and individual board members, of the reputational risk from ESG. And that's another area where I think the ESG committee can support the risk committee. Steve, can I hand over to you just on that question of risk?
No, I would entirely endorse what you've just said, Gillian. The primary concern of the risk committee is always, in the real world, going to be financial risk, and I think that that's where the major focus should be. Absolutely, you need one risk register, and that should be with audit and risk. And I would endorse the idea of ESG at the ESG committee, where it exists, as a mechanism to maybe take some of the heat off the audit and risk committees, and to almost be or to be dealing, not necessarily to be delegating, to having delegated authority from them, because obviously the delegated authority comes from the board, the full board. But I would say that it can help the risk committee, where there is one, and certainly the audit committee, to have an active and engaged ESG committee supporting on those issues. But yeah, in the first instance, the major risks, the risk register, do have to be with the risk committee where there is one, and with audit where there isn't.
Thank you. Alistair, I don't know if you wanted to add anything. We have got a number of other questions as well. Which
really, just to support Steve on this one. The ESG committee can often actually help the risk committee by building out the original risk register to incorporate ESG risks and provide expertise, if you like, in that area. But definitely as a supporting role, and certainly not anything that should supplant or run in parallel to the risk committee.
Thank you. We've received a number of questions about regional differences. I know we touched upon that between the US and Europe. We've also had a question about the UK and Europe, and we've also had a point that aren't all boards different, and aren't sectors very different. And I do appreciate that, if we'd actually given a sectoral breakdown, we'd have been here for hours. So apologies if we've sort of skated over the surface. But if I could turn to my colleagues, any observations on sectoral differences, and any observations on the UK versus Europe? Perhaps, Alistair, if I could just start with you on the sectoral. I know we were discussing this earlier today.
I mean, I think the sectoral, if we look at the emergence of the ESG committees, there are certain sectors that were already very well established as ESG and often had their own ESG committees for a long time. So sectors like mining or energy tended, for obvious reasons, to have a lot of work in this area even before ESG became a much more general point. So we do see big differences. And I think also the point that is made in the question that says, each company is going to have very, very different challenges. And I think I hope that we tried to make that point in the presentation, that the way that these committees need to be set up should be very much dependent on the business and the challenges facing any particular industry or any particular sector, and that the thing we were talking about in terms of ensuring that the remit is appropriately drawn up, and that also that all of the committee's remits are sort of taken as a sort of integral whole, and something like the little organisation chart that Gillian put up in terms of the responsibilities of different committees. All of that thinking has to go in by the board before you think about, before you actually set up the ESG committee. So you kind of start, if you like, with like, what are the challenges? How can we best organise to be able to help address those challenges?
Thank you. And actually, Steve, if I can come to you on the Europe versus UK. I mean, my observation is that Europe has a very strong heritage in sustainability and social sort of, almost been built into many of the jurisdictions. And that's reflected in sort of the development of ESG committees in Europe, and that the UK has come from a slightly different angle, but that they're developing in both. But I'd be interested in your observations on the evolution in those two markets.
No, I absolutely agree with that. I mean, part of the issue, of course, is a unitary board structure versus a two-tier, as in Germany. And Germany for me is a bit of the poster child of what you could call Rhineland capitalism, which has always had a very strong social element to it. And obviously, where you have a supervisory board which does, as with the larger German concerns, have a legally enforced worker participation, mostly union representatives on the board, you get a different dynamic, and I think you get a much more socially oriented dynamic than you do in the UK. So I think certainly continental Europe is coming from quite a different place in terms. I think you could argue they're coming from a place ahead of the UK when it comes to sustainability and social engagement. But I think both geographies are kind of moving in the same direction and doing it in somewhat different ways, reflecting the structure of their boards.
Thank you. My next question is about the pool of candidates. I mean, it's actually phrased for ESG chair roles, but I think, that ESG competence on the board. And this is really a question for Mark. What confidence do we have that there is a strong pool of candidates for that role?
Thank you, Gillian. I think, interestingly, I said during the presentation, it's really the willingness of board members to engage with the topic. And I think organizations such as Chapter Zero have been instrumental in providing a forum for board members to really get up to speed, particularly around the whole environmental and sustainability agenda, for example. And increasingly, there are a number of board courses, particularly Cambridge has become quite a centre for ESG learning. And there they have put on a number of courses for board members in particular to ensure that they're abreast of what is going on, what is required, what is going to be needed. And so when looking at a pool, not everybody is going to be steeped in environmental expertise at all, but we are expecting board members to show that willingness and aptitude to learn and stay abreast of what is going on around this increasingly important topic.
Thank you. I've got a super question here, and thank you for this question. How do you view how do you judge the effectiveness of an ESG committee? And it's a great question because there's so much sort of variation, and unlike other committees which are much more prescribed, you're seeing a range of remit, committee membership, etc. But I'm going to ask Alistair to just some thoughts on how you assess whether an ESG committee is effective or not.
I think the starting point, and you put it up in the slide, is that you've got to decide what is the ESG committee going to be what is the role of that committee? So this is, again, going back to my old kind of thing about you get the remit right and you understand what you're trying to achieve from the committee, and then you judge their success by how well the company is able to achieve those things. So I would say that, if you understand what the committee is supposed to do for you, you can then set up ways of actually measuring the effectiveness of that committee in terms of how well you actually achieve against those targets.
Thank you. And I mean, I absolutely sort of agree with that. And I certainly think, one of the most practical ways of assessing the effectiveness of the committee is to think through how is it supporting the board in getting its arms around this really complicated agenda. It's really sort of that practical kind of working through the ESG issues. And in many ways, this is also what we're seeing in terms of the work of REM and other committees. ESG is quite amorphous, quite difficult to pin down, but it is that practical, really enabling the board to get its arms around what ESG means for the company. We're receiving quite a lot of questions about should the ESG committee include executive members or not? And I know this is something we've been debating, and we see a lot of variety of models. So again, I'm going to go back to Alistair on this, because I know we've been speaking about this quite recently. Alistair, your thoughts on, is this better as a standalone board committee or a sort of a mixed committee between the board and the executive?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we see on the ground is that a lot of ESG committees, I think around half the ESG committees in the FTSE do include executives. Around half of them are non-executive. And I think, and you can shout me down on this. We've had a lot of debates in Fidelio around what is right and what is wrong on this. I think there are arguments both ways. I think my own perspective is that over time we should evolve towards non-executive board committees for ESG in the same way that we have for risk and for audit, etc. And that the way that can happen, again, just I'm always referring back to slides that we've shown, but the one the first one that Gillian showed in terms of the way that the committees are organised, I think was kind of pretty well what we're thinking about the way that the role of the executive versus the board committee for ESG, what their different roles are. And I think that over time, as some of the sort of evolution of ESG, as we start to move towards a much more standardized kind of picture, we will want to move towards a pattern where you've got a non-executive committee on the board. Now, that is my personal view. It's not necessarily the view of Fidelio, but I think we are kind of heading towards that.
I think our view is there needs to be clarity, and ultimately, I think if one thing to perhaps be careful of, the role of the board is oversight and guidance and leadership, and ultimately it can be more difficult to provide the oversight if you're mixing executives and non-executives. We have a question, and perhaps Mark can help us here. For the Chief Sustainability Officer, where should this role sit, and should this role sit at executive committee level? And what is the relationship, and perhaps Alistair might have some views here as well, between the Chief Sustainability Officer and the board ESG committee? So perhaps Mark, just on where we're seeing the ESG, the CSO sit in terms of the executive structure of the organisation.
Yes, thank you, Gillian. I mean, this is an extraordinarily dynamic area at the moment. I think you only have to go back a year or two and you found the CSO very much involved with the implementation aspects of sustainability, doing a lot of the work in terms of the materiality. What we've seen, and that role was reporting to any number of different people. There was no consistency whatsoever. What we've seen now is an emergence of the CSO moving to ExCo or near ExCo and reporting directly to the CEO. And the reason for this, and the term I've used, is the CSO is now becoming the new strategy director, is that for companies that are going to be implementing their net zero targets, many of which are not very far away, this will involve a total rethink of the business model. And as such, the CSO is going to be incredibly influential, incredibly important in terms of help define that business model as they try to achieve their net zero targets. And the implications are numerous, whether it be financing, whether it be how they manage their customer needs, their supplier needs, etc. So I think what we're seeing now is we're getting up over 50% of CSOs reporting directly to the CEO and working with the executive and the board, really chart how the business is going to operate over the next 10, 15 years.
Thank you. And the second part of the question was about how the CSO engages with the ESG committee, the board level ESG committee. I think Alistair's been clear, probably better ultimately not to be a member of that committee. But Alistair, can I hand over to you, just any thoughts you have on that relationship between the CSO and the ESG committee?
Yes, I mean, firstly, I agree with everything that Mark said, and this is something we talked about in detail at an earlier webinar that we had that many of you who are on this one may have seen about the CSO role and how that's evolving over time. I simply see the relationship as you would expect between an executive and his board review. So between the CFO and the audit committee or whatever, that the CSO is going to play a major role in terms of presenting to the board committee and setting out what the executive is doing, and that for the committee to review and challenge and oversee, and in much the same way that we see between the board and the executive normally. And that's one of the reasons why I'm firmly in the camp of saying that the CEO or the CSO should not sit on that committee. It should be separated out, and then it should report it in the same way that executives report into the board for oversight.
Thank you. We're receiving a lot of questions, and I'm not sure that we're going to be able to get through them all. So I'd like to take sort of two wrap-up final questions. One is just going back to differences between sectors and just, kind of drivers, I guess, financial services on the one hand and maybe industrial extractives, automotive on the other. And maybe, Steve, if I could just hand over to you, just in terms of that response to ESG and ESG committees, what you're seeing in different types of, in different sectors.
Well, I think you could almost simplify this by saying that as Alistair's already said, if you're in the business of digging holes in the ground and processing ore, then you're pretty focused on the environment, you're pretty focused on safety. And I think when you look at manufacturing businesses, the same is true of autos, it's the same of most engineering businesses, that there's because you've got large physical assets and people are actually moving things around relative to the Earth's surface, you have a very, very big focus on environmental. And I think those are then the sorts of businesses that tend to have big carbon footprints. As we know, the big carbon footprints are in industries like building materials, steel, cement, and then onto large manufacturing industry. So I think those are the sorts of industries that are going to be focusing on climate change. So they're going to be focusing on the E very, very strongly in their ESG committees and endeavours. In places like the UK, where you have a slightly less physical economy, where you have more financial services, you have more service-based, I do think the S is actually really important, because I think you get dynamics around the S in financial services where there are obviously real regulatory issues and social issues in terms of subprime lending and those kinds of things. And you also see it in industries such as gambling, where there's a major potential social impact. So I think the focus really on the elements of ESG is just different by industry, and I think if you overlay industry and country, you tend to get different emphases. So in the UK, it is less physical, more around the S, and certainly in places like Germany, it's more physical and it's more about the E. But part of the role of the ESG committee and the ESG committee chair is to get their minds around this and to have a good matrix of the impacts, the risks, and how that all fits together, and what the key metrics are. I mean, what comes to me as an investor is, back to the question of how do you know whether or not the ESG committee is doing a good job? For me, it's around the metrics and what way those metrics are moving. And if I'm an investor in a company that purports to be a good ESG performer, I want to see the metrics and I want to see them moving in the right direction.
Thank you. Actually, that's a super note to end the Q&A. And we had got we've got a couple more questions. And I think what I'm going to do is that we'll get back to you individually. We can see who's asked the question. So we'll make sure that the questions are addressed. So if we could just flip to the concluding chart, please, Alex, and really just tying up, I think we've, emphasised ESG imperative is increasing. It's clearly a board issue. And for many boards, not all, it warrants an ESG committee. Our view is the ESG committee chair needs to understand the key issues, but doesn't need to be the technical expert. Effective chairing and communication, and increasingly an understanding of business transformation is critical. And we do expect an overall upskilling of boards, particularly in the area of environmental skills. The next chart, please. Looking forward, we'll see that we have a number of events coming up focused on the board and effectiveness. The next one is the board and the AGM season. We also have financial regulation meets climate change in October, and consumer duty and board responsibility. So it's going to be a heavy duty October in terms of governance with Fidelio. We hope that you'll be able to join us for some of those. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all of you for attending. It's been a super audience and there've been great questions, and we will be sure to share go back to some of the questions that weren't addressed. We'll also share the charts. And I'd like to thank my colleagues for galloping through a complex subject, and I hope helping to shine a light, or at least reflect what we're seeing in the market and the trends in terms of good practice with regard to ESG. On this very sombre and sad day, I'd like to say thank you to all of you. And I know our thoughts, as we started out, are with the royal family and also with the Queen in gratitude for her service. Thank you all very much indeed. Goodbye.